Well, greetings and welcome to City Lights Live, the online component of the City Lights events calendar. I am your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush peoples. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. Tonight, City Lights and NYU Press celebrate the publication of Get It Out on the Politics of Hysterectomy. We are delighted to have with us its author, Andréa Becker. Get It Out explores a seldom talked about subject, yet one which will touch the lives of many women. The hysterectomy is one of the most common gynecological surgeries worldwide. By the age of 65, 1 out of 5 people born with a uterus will have it removed. So one begs the question, why is this procedure so seldom talked about? In Get It Out, Andréa Becker weaves centuries of medical history with a substantial body of personal research to highlight the struggle for bodily and reproductive autonomy. Get It Out unravels the various problems with how we medically treat uteruses and the people who have them. It interrogates how little choice people with uteruses ultimately have over their reproductive health and explores what these choices signify amid interlocking systems of inequality. Andréa Becker is a medical sociologist, researcher, and writer. She is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Hunter College at CUNY. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, and Slate. She's going to be joined tonight by Moira Donegan, who is, of course, no stranger to City Lights. It's really a pleasure to have worked with her many times before. Moira is a writer and critic who covers gender, politics, and the law, and is a writer in residency at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University, and has been a regular contributor to The Guardian, amongst other publications. Her first book, Gone Too Far, Me Too, Backlash and the Future of Feminist Politics, is forthcoming from Scribner. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Andréa Becker and Moira Donegan. It is great to have you both with us tonight. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter. And it's really good to be here with Andréa, whose book I so loved. And I just want everybody to take a moment to reflect on just how common hysterectomy is. That statistic that Peter told to us, 1 in 5 people who are born with a uterus eventually has it surgically removed. And I think, Andréa, that was something that really kind of shocked me when I read your book, because I had not had the occasion to think about just how common this was before. So before we really dig into it, I know you wanted to read a little bit from your author's note that opens the book that I thought was so lovely. Do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Definitely. And thank you all so much for being here and spending some time with me in my book. And of course, to Moira for being here too. So here it is, what it looks like. Okay, go ahead and get started. This book is dedicated to the uterus, a misunderstood organ, an organ dubbed the origin of all disease in Hippocratic texts, the organ we all once called home. Though only the size of a fist, it's been forced to hold impossibly large societal questions and controversies. The uterus is a cultural battleground on which to debate where life begins, a woman's right to choose, how much pain is ordinary pain, and what it means to align your body to match your gender. I dedicate this book to every scientist, every writer, every doctor, every policymaker, every person working to shed light on the needlessly mysterious ways of the uterus and to improve life for the people who have them. Many with uteruses were taught to feel shame about this organ and its manifold functions. I, for one, was taught to hide my tampon wrappers in tissue, lest my male relatives be forced to see evidence of my menstruation in the trash can of our shared bathroom, evidence that I have a uterus, an organ that bleeds. Many grew up saying phrases like lady parts, down there, and my time of the month. And even those of us who menstruate every month weren't taught to fully understand the menstrual cycle, including the differences between menstruation and ovulation, and the names of the hormones involved in these twin processes. The medical and scientific communities reflect this censoring and lack of knowing amid countless gaps in research and treatments. There are 5 times more studies on erectile dysfunction than there are on premenstrual syndrome, for instance, even though over 90% of people with uteruses experience PMS. We have known about uterus-adjacent diseases like endometriosis and uterine fibroids for more than 100 years. Yet without adequate research, these highly common illnesses remain mysterious and difficult to treat. It is within this lack of knowing about the uterus that shame seeps in. This book is dedicated to everyone who struggles with their uterus or lack thereof, to everyone whose uterine pain has been minimized by doctors, parents, peers, and teachers, to everyone who had ailments of pain that went undiagnosed for years, to everyone who wishes they never had a uterus to begin with, to everyone who wishes they were born with a uterus, to everyone who longs for a uterus that can carry a healthy pregnancy to term. There are countless unanswered questions about the uterus, but with every story told, we are one step closer to understanding this unnecessarily black box. It has been an honor to be tasked with collecting and recording the uterus stories in this book. Stories that, like the uterus itself, reflect strength, resilience, and regeneration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think that really is such a lovely introduction to this like very weighty organ and the systems of symbolism and sort of social value that are attached to having it taken out. So I wanted to ask you, before we really dig into the findings that you have in this like expansive study of some people who have had hysterectomies, why hysterectomy? What drew you to this subject matter of all the many, many different things you could be looking at as a medical sociologist?
Yeah, so once I learned how common it was, so when I started this project, it was 1 in 3, not 1 in 5. And I was so shocked that it was so common, and yet no one talks about it in our daily life, but also in these like research circles that I'm in. I'm in reproductive health, sexual health research groups, and no one talks about hysterectomy. There's been one sociology book dedicated to this topic, and it's over 20 years old now. It's called Am I Still a Woman?, which shows us a little bit about how it needed a little bit more updating, but obviously very formative. And as an abortion researcher, I've been really interested in the moral panics that proliferate around the idea of ending one pregnancy. So I thought, what would it mean for society, for culture, to excise this capacity altogether by removing the organ? And so there were a lot of questions there for me to dig through. And that's how it led me to the book. But I also want to make sure we all know what a hysterectomy is, because again, even though it's incredibly common, I find that a lot of people don't know what it is. So I've had people confuse it with a vasectomy over and over, I guess because it has his in it. But it's the removal of the uterus, and it can include the ovaries and cervix, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah, this was something I found really interesting about your research, because your book is focused on a group of people who have only become sort of possible at a fairly recent stage of history, which is those who have like quote unquote elective hysterectomies.
Yeah.
And those people, many of them, get to choose the extent to which the organs are removed, right? They get to choose whether the hysterectomy will include the removal of the ovaries or the removal of the fallopian tubes or the removal of the cervix. Do you want to tell us a little bit about why you focused on this group of people who have had what are termed elective, which might be a little bit of a misnomer, which I'm also eager to get into, hysterectomies, as opposed to other people who have hysterectomies because of what are deemed life-threatening conditions?
So when we hear elective, it elicits this idea that we're picking it, like it's not necessarily life-saving, it's not absolutely critical, but 90% of hysterectomies are considered elective. And so the 10% that are considered essential or life-saving are those that are performed because of cancer in these organs. And so only in those moments where the organs are immediately life-threatening is it considered life-saving. And the other dozens of cases that call for a hysterectomy, like endometriosis, adenomyosis, things like uterine prolapse, conditions that lead to immense amounts of chronic pain and bleeding, difficulty having sex, these sorts of horrible things, it's still considered elective. But what I have found throughout the book is that the people who have them and choose them don't consider it elective. They consider it life-saving. It largely improved their quality of life in many cases. It removed this huge burden and source of pain and just discomfort. And so that led me, so I chose only elective to explore what it means, what elective even means in healthcare, why we have this binary between life-saving elective, and how with this black and white binary that we have, how it leads to ideology seeping in, and doctors, healthcare systems, insurance companies are able to make medical decisions based on ideological and cultural factors rather than like medical necessity.
So there's two that you brought up a lot right there. There's
Yeah.
two questions I want to ask you based on what you just said. One is like, just for those of us who through luck or ignorance don't totally know what kind of medical conditions beyond cancer might lead somebody to seek out a hysterectomy. What does that look like? And then secondly, what had to happen for hysterectomy to be something that people could do even in, what are termed not exactly life-saving or non-emergent situations?
Yeah, so in the book, I trace the long history of the emergence of gynecology. And so hysterectomies, even though we think of surgery as this modern medical marvel, they go back to ancient Greece. I found some in like BC and 120 AD. But essentially, early hysterectomies were considered a like last resort for terminally ill women. They were very exploratory, even well into the 1800s. And there was a really high mortality rate, really high rates of infection and complications. But as surgery became more refined, we had inventions like antibiotics and antiseptics, and so those anesthesia, these really crucial inventions. So it led surgery to be safer, and as well as hysterectomy specifically. And then in the 1980s, the late 1980s, the first laparoscopic hysterectomy was performed. So before it was this huge cross-body incision, it was a lot of downtime, really complex surgery. Now a robot can do it, essentially. And so it's
with much
considered
smaller incisions, right? Yeah.
It's 3 to 5 keyhole incisions.
In the abdomen, right? Like the lower abdomen. Yeah.
The abdomen, and oftentimes it's pulled out of the vagina, which I think is really interesting. That's not what we would think of how it happens. But so now it's considered outpatient oftentimes, and also minimally invasive. And so the downtime and the complications have really shrunk because of the refinement of the technology. And you had asked me something else.
Well, I'm interested in like how the changes in technology have made this from a life-altering, major, painful, intense surgery that a lot of those early patients didn't survive into something that can be opted into, something that people might do to improve their quality of life and to like align their body more with what they want from their life as opposed to just maintaining bare life, right? That's like a big change. And this also, I think, leads us back to like, well, why are people seeking out hysterectomies? We know that it's not considered elective if you have a cancer in those organs, right? But what are the other reasons why people might opt into it?
Yeah, definitely. So a hysterectomy is essentially a catch-all solution for anything that can go wrong in these organs, because we're essentially in the dark ages of understanding the uterus, ovaries, and cervix. So some of the most common indications for hysterectomy are endometriosis. So for those that don't know, 1 out of 10 people born with a uterus has endometriosis, and this is likely an undercount. So within this condition, cells that are similar to the uterine lining grow elsewhere in the body. It's essentially causes these really painful growths that are often invisible even on ultrasounds. So even though we've known about endometriosis for over 100 years, we can still only diagnose it through surgery, through opening the body. And I find that infuriating and crazy. But Other issues are uterine fibroids, which is so it's these growths that happen inside the uterus, and they're overrepresented among Black American women. Adenomyosis, that's what Lena Dunham had, which we can get into later if we want. But essentially, the uterus becomes warped through these growths within the uterine wall. Yeah, so many things that can happen because we don't have full cures or treatments for a lot of these things unless you want to go in and out of surgery or try various kinds of hormonal birth control, these other treatments that cause a lot of side effects. And so oftentimes hysterectomy becomes the best solution that people actively want and that they're actively desiring and, you know, fighting doctors to try to get it in many cases. And then lastly, I'll mention that half of the people that I spoke to are trans or non-binary. So hysterectomy is also part of gender affirming healthcare. It has been for many years for many reasons. You know, some people don't want to have this organ for gendered reasons, and then other people, it's not clear within the research how long-term use of testosterone will impact these organs. And so some cautious doctors and patients choose to remove the organs altogether just in case that there's some cancer risk. But yeah, we can get into how the muddiness of that and the constraints there. But so I'll stop. Those are some of the reasons why someone might want a hysterectomy or might have happen one.
Before we move on, I do want to shout out the chat, our beautiful chat, where you folks can put any questions you might have for Andrea. We're going to do a Q&A towards the end, our last 15 minutes or so together, and we'll be able to field all your questions and answer them. And I had a ton of questions that I just would come up with as I was reading, and then you would answer them so generously a few pages later. So one other thing you can do if you have a lot of questions is buy the book. But Andrea, I'm really interested in how you lay out in these different reasons. You know, people might have a medical condition that's causing them pain. Some people might be looking to elect into infertility because they don't want to have children or don't want to have any more children. And then it's this whole spectrum of gender affirming care that could include a hysterectomy. And I think what you're laying out in these different reasons is a little bit of these different populations, right? These things endometriosis doesn't discriminate. You can get it if you're across the different spectrum of people who are born with this organ. But then I think different populations also have different obstacles or different conditions under which they get a hysterectomy. That to me was the real meat of your book, right? The way that this procedure is presented differently and made differently available across these different strata of identity.
Yeah. So hysterectomy is part of a broader study of stratified reproduction. That's what we call it. And essentially what stratified reproduction means is that who you are, where you live, how much money you make, your citizenship status, these individual markers determine the degree of freedom you have to make reproductive choices. And so hysterectomy is one part of this. You know, we tend to focus on abortion as a reproductive choice that is stratified, but then when you start to look elsewhere, every aspect of reproduction is stratified within these interlocking systems of inequality. And so with a hysterectomy, you know, I go through the history very extensively in the book, but so it is a continuation of a lot of these different pieces of medicine, like racialization of medicine, the eugenics movement in the 20th century. And so the stories that I looked at showed how, again, who you are, what you look like, where you live, determine the degree to which you can choose a hysterectomy. And the way that ended up looking was that, you know, white cisgender women were often told by their doctors, that's too extreme, let's wait, let's hold off on that. You're too young, even well into their 30s. You'll want babies later on, you'll change your mind. Your future husband will want one. I heard that from many people, even people that I spoke to that are lesbians, like, what do you mean my future husband? And so, and then on the other side of the coin, a lot of like Black women, Afro-Latina women were told, oh no, a hysterectomy is your only option. You should get one. This is your only solution. And so it really mapped onto race and class lines as well as where in the country you live. And I just found that so infuriating that, you know, it's the same procedure, it's the same organ, but like who you are on the outside determines your path towards this procedure.
I think you're touching on something really fraught and loaded that brings up for me a lot of questions about what it means for different people to choose hysterectomy. Hysterectomy is also a procedure that has been foisted involuntarily on people who do not require it for life-saving reasons, right? And this is something that you go into very interestingly in your book. Do you want to fill us in on that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I realized a lot of people don't know that the US had a massive eugenics campaign. So throughout the 20th century, there were eugenics boards in various states. Some of the most egregious ones were California, and North Carolina. So what happened in these cases were that states and eugenics boards would decide whether or not someone should be forcibly sterilized. And so they began in Indiana as a way of curbing the births of poor, uneducated white men, actually. But then it became wielded as a tool to limit the births of primarily low-income Black and brown women throughout the country. And it was upheld by the Supreme Court. I don't think a lot of people realize that Buck v. Bell actually determined that it was constitutional to have eugenics boards, to have forced sterilization campaigns. And also of note, there is evidence that the Third Reich, Hitler's regime was inspired by California's eugenics boards, and there was some collaboration and communication there, which I think is important to bring up. And so you have this history of forced sterilization among communities that have been marginalized in the US and elsewhere. And so, of course, a procedure that is essentially leads to infertility, even though you might have your ovaries, it leads to an inability to produce a pregnancy naturally. Of course, it's going to have a different weight, different meaning, determined by what community you're part of. And so this history ends up weighing in with not only how doctors approach the procedure, but also how patients are going to receive the idea of a hysterectomy and how they're going to experience it, whether they will feel joyful about it or immense grief. So there's a wide array of feelings you can have around it, even though we talk overwhelmingly about hysterectomy is always a terrible thing. In the book, I get into how it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point because when we look at hysterectomy, we see a situation or a procedure which, like abortion, has been at the center of the contest between individuals trying to live their own lives and states and institutions like hospitals, like medical boards that are trying to override those choices and make decisions for them, right? And in the case of hysterectomy, because it does involve sterilization and the end of, reproductive potential of that kind, it also means that the way that people are given access to it or prevented from having access to it will really align with these kinds of eugenics logics, right? Do you want to tell us a little bit? And I think you take this from Dorothy Roberts, whose work is all over yours, like Killing the Black Body is a book that everybody should read. It'll change how you think about reproductive politics in America. And I think it's Roberts, you said, who made this distinction between positive and negative eugenics.
Yes, no, everyone should absolutely read Dorothy Roberts' work. She's absolutely brilliant. So what she refers to and what I draw on in the book is the idea of positive and negative eugenics. And so when we think of eugenics, we tend to think of, as I mentioned, like curbing the wrong kinds of births. So things like forced sterilization, forcing birth control and long-acting contraceptives on low income and Black women and girls. But we think less about what's called positive eugenics, and that's the encouraging of the right kinds of births. And so if you look at the history of abortion and birth control, you see these conflicting parallel stories where we were simultaneously conducting these forced sterilization campaigns and also really worried about the growing popularity around abortion and birth control because white middle-class women were using it. So we think of the development of birth control as this tipping point in sexual liberation for women and like feminism. We think of it as this really empowering thing, but it happened alongside this desire to curb white women from being able to use birth control and abortion. And we're seeing that again today. The pronatalist movement is growing rapidly all around us. In many ways, like Elon Musk, for instance, is one of the most famous pronatalists that we know. So it's everywhere all around us. And I will also say that birth control, the way that it was developed, was unethically on women in Puerto Rico. There were clinical trials there, and women were given really large doses of these hormones without full informed consent about what would happen to them. And so that's another way that you see stratified reproduction, where white middle-class women see birth control as this really empowering tool, but it was also this really dark technology for other communities as well. And so it shows us how the same procedure, the same medical technology can have these vast meanings depending on who you are.
That was something I found really moving in your interviews. And Andrea's book is based around dozens and dozens of interviews with people who had these elective, quote unquote, elective hysterectomies. And you treat these patients with so much curiosity and compassion. And I really just loved getting to see their stories through your work. And something I found really moving was the way that Black patients were grappling with this history. Scenarios where their medical suffering could be alleviated by a hysterectomy that would be performed by some of the same institutions and certainly the same discipline that had historically removed that elective choice and made that choice for other women who looked like them. Do you want to talk about how they grappled with that history a little bit?
Definitely. Yeah. So there were two ways I found that people grappled with this history. One was knowing about, the history of forced sterilization, of birth control being, experimented on Black and brown women and girls' bodies. And so knowing that history led people to not want a hysterectomy, to be offended that it was offered as an option, to try to fight having a hysterectomy as much as possible, and to try all these other things. And another way was viewing it as an empowering choice that they had when their ancestors might not have, when their own mothers might not have had this choice. They were able to choose it actively in order to have a better life. And so there were different ways of grappling with it. So even though there are these clear race and gender patterns that I noticed, of course, there's variation within them. And again, like the same surgery can spark so many different meanings.
And you mentioned that by and large, the people of color you interviewed for this found that hysterectomy was offered to them more readily than white patients did. And there's something here about that history of eugenics echoing in the sense of fertility being disposable and renounceable versus it having to be preserved, right? Because on the other hand, you recount the stories of some patients, many of whom were white, who found that their account of their pain and discomfort was not valued as highly by medical providers as their productive capacity was. You want to tell me about their experiences?
Yeah, definitely. So there are two stories that I looked at side by side. There were so many parallels there. So I call them Stacy and Luna. And Stacy and Luna were both in their early 20s, living in mid to large cities, and had the same endometriosis symptoms, which are really intense chronic pain, really excessive bleeding, and the inability to locate where this pain is coming from. But Luna is a Black woman and Stacy is a white woman. And so while Luna was told offhand in the hospital, she went to the emergency room for pain that she was experiencing. She was really scared. And she was 19 years old, or 19 or 20 years old. And they told her, no, you'll need a hysterectomy no matter what. That's your only choice. And she told me she was really jarred by that, really taken aback that they would offer that to someone so young. And then Stacy, again, very similar profile in terms of her symptoms, her age. She was told, no, you shouldn't have a hysterectomy. You're way too young. And in fact, why don't you try pregnancy instead? Pregnancy can cure you, or if not, like you'll have 9 months of no pain. And she was so taken aback that this doctor told her, no, a pregnancy at your age is not as big of a deal as getting a hysterectomy. Like that is too big a deal. We're not going to do that for you. And they even told her, like, oh, if you don't want a baby right now, you can always just place it for adoption after the pregnancy fixes you. And I should say there's no evidence that a pregnancy will cure these chronic diseases. Like for some people, they experience less symptoms while they're pregnant, but by no means will it cure them.
There was one case study in your book of a woman who followed that advice and got pregnant twice. And then after the birth of her second child, found that she had resumed endometriosis symptoms and then also 2 small children to care for.
Yeah, that was a really upsetting story too. She is a Dominican American woman, and so that's a case where it didn't fall neatly onto the racial patterns that I mentioned. But of course, there's always variation. But yeah, she told me that the doctor said you'll eventually need a hysterectomy, but if you get pregnant now, it'll maybe fix you, and this is your chance. And she told me, who am I to question the doctor? So she got pregnant years before she and her husband would have. And then so she had this baby, noticed she still had pain and plus a new baby. But then her doctor recommended she try one more time. So she had another baby. Yeah, and again, still really terrible symptoms. So then her doctor told her, well, now hysterectomy is your only option. So yeah, this binary of pregnancy versus hysterectomy just is really telling of how little we know about these organs and the way that they fail us and how to fix it for people beyond using them for a baby or getting it out altogether. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I wish you wouldn't, because this is the thing that I kept coming back to reading this book. I was like, how is this the only option? You know, because it is a maximalist gesture, right? You're not a person with a lot of ideological opposition to, you know, rejecting fertility, but like it is about all she wrote in terms of having biological children for a lot of these patients. And it is a, you know, even with these great innovations, it remains a major surgery that, you know, deprives your body of an organ that has functions beyond baby making as well.
Yes.
And yet, it is the only treatment available for a very common and at times debilitatingly painful condition that is endometriosis, right? And I'm wondering about, you know, there is a little bit of a disjoint for me between how much technological advancement there has been made in hysterectomy and in things like IVF, right? And then in how little has been made in understanding something like endometriosis or something like the causes of fibroids. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of like knowledge gap?
Definitely. And something that really illustrates the issue is that, so with endometriosis, women and people who aren't women but have uteruses wait around 7 to 10 years on average to be diagnosed with endometriosis. And that's because we've normalized having pain in these organs. We've normalized having any sort of suffering when it comes to these organs. And so oftentimes people, doctors will minimize it, but also people's mothers who menstruated and had bad periods, they'll say, no, this is how it was for me. This is normal. We just have bad periods in our family. So it becomes very much normalized. But then the time to diagnosis actually shrinks if you're trying to have a baby. So if you're having difficulty conceiving a healthy pregnancy, then your time to diagnosis shrinks. And so suddenly doctors are like, let's figure out what's actually happening here. Let's investigate this. And so it really tells us how when we view these organs primarily as baby making, we miss the opportunity to learn about the other functions of these organs, but also how to make sure people can have pain-free, healthy, happy lives beyond just using these organs to create a baby.
It says something too, I think, about the status of women whose, reproductive capacity is valued even when their experience of pain is discounted.
Yeah.
I think that brings us to another moment, which is we talked a lot about cis women the time we've been together, but something I really loved about your book was how much attention you paid to people who are trans and non-binary, who are seeking out hysterectomy or being given hysterectomies as part of that course of transition care. And I was fascinated because when I realized that that was going to be such a major part of the book and that you had interviewed so many of these patients, I at first expected, like, okay, this is going to be an account of resistance to receiving like gender affirming medicine in this way. And that's not exactly what it was. It was something more complicated and more revealing. Do you want to tell me a little bit about your patients or your interviewees who were in this category of patient?
Definitely. Yeah. So I mentioned how the way that people experienced a hysterectomy was from joy to grief, right? But then you can also feel completely neutral about this procedure. And that tended to be, which I was surprised, trans and non-binary people. So that's the one population where hysterectomy is considered essential and it's considered gender affirming. And yet for a lot of people, they, if you take testosterone for many years, your menstruation might cease altogether and you might forget you have that organ, right? It might have no bearing in your life at all. But then because of this idea that you might have an increased risk of disease because of your testosterone, people will cautiously remove it, as I mentioned when we first started talking. And so I was surprised to hear people talk to me about hysterectomies as just this neutral procedure. One guy told me, well, it would be like if I broke my arm, I would say, I'm glad it's not broken anymore. Or another man, when I asked him how he feels about his hysterectomy, he said, it's like getting your flu shot. I don't really want a flu shot, but I'll do it if you say that that'll keep me healthy. And so I was just really fascinated by this idea of hysterectomy as a neutral medical procedure, since we treat it as anything but, and especially because trans health is so contested.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to read these guys' accounts of their transition, where many of them were saying, it's like, well, my priorities really were testosterone treatment
and top surgery. Yeah.
Which reveals a lot about like how gender is socially reproduced, right? Like it's like they want to feel more like themselves. They want most of all to change the things that they can see and that other people can see, right? To try and achieve a recognition and a visible marker of their gender identity.
Yeah.
In the social world, right? For themselves and for other people. Whereas the uterus, because it can't be seen, and because, as you mentioned, the testosterone treatment often eliminates some of its like activities like menstruation, it didn't have the same resonance. That was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think we forget that even though it holds so much weight, we don't see our uterus in everyday life. It's this invisible organ that it produces a bunch of labor, it produces a lot of inequalities, but in our day-to-day life, we might not interact with it unless it's actively, plotting against us or bleeding or, causing these horrible things. And especially if once, for a lot of trans people, they might not think about it at all, especially if they're not having the type of sex that would lead to a pregnancy. It has, little daily meanings. I will say that for some of the non-binary people I spoke to, particularly if they weren't engaging with other forms of gender affirming care like testosterone, a hysterectomy could also be very gender affirming. Like some people said, oh, I feel great knowing that I can never have a pregnancy. I can never be looked at as a mom, as a mother, which is, so reproduction is so gendered. So of course, removing it could feel really, really affirming for some people. And it also removes the, oftentimes the necessity to go to the gynecologist. And that's another site where there's this tension between being trans and non-binary in this highly feminized space, which I talk about a lot in the book.
Yeah. And there's something about the barriers to access for trans people, which I don't want to like understate how hard it is to get gender affirming care for a
Right.
lot of the people who are seeking it out. But it did strike me as very interesting that a lot of these trans guys you were talking to, and really more like the trans guys who have been on a testosterone regimen more than like the non-binary people who might not be engaging with other kinds of that care. It seemed like they got a lot more deference from healthcare providers, including the white guys who, had they not transitioned, would look more like the cis women who are receiving this kind of pushback and emphasis on the preservation of their fertility. It seemed like transition and masculinization of the body put them into this different category. Preservation of their fertility was not as high a priority for their medical providers. And I was like, okay, is this a negative eugenics story in which, like a lot of these like Black women and other women of color, their fertility is not being highly valued the way that white women's is? Or is this a male privilege story where the masculinization of their bodies has led to increased deference for their wishes for how those bodies are going to function? Like it was crazy.
Oh, I would definitely say it's both. One guy told me like, oh yeah, I think it's easy for trans men to get hysterectomies because they don't want men to be pregnant. Like that, there's this trope over and over in the media of the pregnant man as this like shock factor. So, it blows the mind that a man could be pregnant.
There was
But
that crazy Arnold Schwarzenegger movie in like 1995 or something called Junior, where Arnold Schwarzenegger gets pregnant. It's not worth watching. Don't bother.
no. Yeah, the grad student Carlos Sariego is also looking at this trope of the pregnant man and how the dissonance there with trans people reproducing and how it's because of this idea of like a pregnant man is ludicrous or like a crazy plot point. It's led to this like invisibility of trans reproduction, even though of course trans and non-binary people have always formed families and needed all aspects of reproductive health care. Yeah. So it's definitely both. It's definitely a question of negative eugenics, but also this this idea of male privilege, which I didn't get fully into in the book. I did write an article about how men experience this like night and day interactions with their doctors. The more and more masculine they look, the suddenly doctors cared about their pain. One guy told me when he was a cis woman, or viewed as a cis woman, he had these horrible ovarian cysts. And one time it ruptured and he went to the hospital for the pain he was experiencing. They didn't take it seriously. He had to like really ask over and over for them to look into it. And then a week before I interviewed him, he said, oh, I actually fractured my pinky last week as a man. And they took it so seriously. They wanted to like get me into care immediately and gave me pain meds. And so, yeah, it was this interesting thing where it's the same people. So it's kind of this like case study of how the more masculine you are, even if you're in this, contested or stigmatized category in our like transphobic world, you can still gain like male privilege in the medical system in a really interesting way.
That's fascinating. And I'm gonna shout out again, we can take your questions. If you want to put them in the chat, we don't bite. We'd love to hear from you. But I wanted to talk to you, Andrea, about something that you mentioned a couple minutes ago about these different feelings people have, because it seems like there's a big spectrum, and it seems like part of what informs their feelings about it is the degree of just autonomy and desire they had for this procedure. Could you tell me a little bit about how circumstances affected people's feelings about their hysterectomies?
Absolutely. So the way we talk about hysterectomy is overwhelmingly, I guess, something that will bring grief, that something that's forced upon you that you should try to avoid at all costs. But what I found from the 100 stories in my book, it's a lot more complicated, and it ranges from joy to grief and somewhere in between. And so for the women that I mentioned who did feel like this was chosen for them, that it was forced upon them before they fully understood they didn't need to have a hysterectomy necessarily, or they could try other options first. A hysterectomy there did bring sources of grief and loss, maybe even cases of feeling less feminine. So that in that case, it did align with the common idea of what a hysterectomy will cause to people. But then the people who were fighting for hysterectomy, who were telling their doctors for years, I want a hysterectomy, once they finally got it, they felt immense joy and relief and delight at having this organ that had been plotting against them removed, right? And so it tells us, again, it's not the surgery necessarily, but the degree in which you feel you are choosing the surgery.
There's something here about that I want to zoom out. And if this makes no sense, please let me. But like one of the critiques I read of, like reproductive choice, the politics of choice, right? Or the rhetoric of reproductive choice is from the left, saying it's like, okay, well, you're talking about health as if you're a consumer. You're talking about health as something that you have a consumption right to, and that this is maybe, not partaking of a collective politics, right? It's very focused on the individual.
Mhm.
And it strikes me that a lot of your patients in your study do seem to be sort of reaching towards a more utopian world, a world where people who are born with a uterus, regardless of how they identify or what other sort of identity markers might be shaping their experience, would be able to have a fuller range of reproductive choices as an extension of having a fuller range of like identity choices and social role choices. And I wanted to know, like, what do you see as being sort of the social ask behind this study of hysterectomy? Like, what is the utopia that you're reaching for?
Yeah, so the original title of this book was Unchoosable, because across all of these different cases, like you're not fully choosing a hysterectomy, right? So even if you really, really want one, maybe you wouldn't want one in a society where your pelvic pain is taken seriously, where we invest in different technologies to cure the different ailments that you might be experiencing in these organs. You might not choose a hysterectomy, right? And so it becomes a constrained choice. Or in the cases where a trans man feels neutral about it, but he's getting it amid these gaps in research around whether or not you need it. Again, it's also constrained because you might not get it, you might not choose it or want it or feel neutral about it if we knew that you definitively whether or not it was needed by, after robust longitudinal research. And so there's all of these different ways that choosing a hysterectomy is ultimately constrained and unchoosable. And so if it was fully choosable, then we would have so many other advancements much wider than hysterectomy. We would have, a medical system where it doesn't depend on who you are or where you live to get really excellent care. Where it doesn't matter if you are, in Manhattan or in rural, I don't know, Arkansas, that every doctor would be trained in treating and identifying these illnesses that are really common. It's still considered specialized care and like specialized knowledge. And it would also be a world in which all doctors have trans competence, which is absolutely not the case. So in addition to the strange, to say the least, terrain of legality around trans health, there's also huge gaps in trans competence in healthcare. And so what I call out to in the book is that in order to make hysterectomy fully choosable, we would be like remaking a lot of these systems from the ground up.
Ambitious. I love it. Towards a world where everybody who wants and needs one can get a hysterectomy and nobody who doesn't ever has to have one. We've got a question. Our
Yay.
brave attendee, Molly Pifko. Hi, Molly. She says, question for the Q&A. I'm thinking about what you said about a patient being told she's too young to choose a hysterectomy. This reminded me very much of narratives around both abortion and gender affirming care, i.e. a patient being told that they're too young to have an abortion, but by implication old enough to carry a pregnancy to term against her will, or the court in Scrimeti implying that trans young people are incapable of giving informed consent to treatment that might impact their fertility because they can't truly understand what that means. How has this book shaped your thinking about about the relationship between gender, age, and agency?
That's such a beautiful question. Yeah, so throughout these various stories, we saw that the meaning of age had completely different, or that the concept of age had completely different meanings across who you were. And it also points to this idea of protecting you from yourself, of doctors protecting you from the possibility of regret in the future. And you're absolutely right that we see this notion of future regret wielded against people wanting abortion and people wanting gender affirming care, right? So we regret things in our life all of the time, but we see it weaponized against these two cases where this healthcare is stigmatized in some way or contentious in some way. And so hysterectomy is another extension of that, where it's paternalistic. It's doctors saying, you don't actually know what you want, but I do. And so we're going to protect you through all of these different laws and regulations when, in reality, people think very carefully about what they want with their bodies, and they know what they want in like so many of these cases. And even if they do feel, twinges of regret about getting it, that's part of life. People regret getting nose jobs, people regret getting BBLs, but it doesn't have this huge cultural weight that it does when we think about other forms of stigmatized healthcare, like sterilization procedures, like hysterectomy, like abortion, like gender affirming care.
I'm interested in this notion of like the right to make your own mistakes potentially, right?
Yeah.
And if you really think about it, every day we make a choice, many choices that we can never undo. Like I cannot undo the 5 p.m. coffee I had that I think I'm going to regret at about 10 o'clock tonight. We make all these kinds of choices all the time, but the body is the one place where nobody can be with you and nobody else can experience it. It's all you. So I think that is one argument among many for the primacy of bodily autonomy. Andréa, I want to thank you so much for your time and for this book, which is so fascinating and so attentive to the ways that this procedure is stigmatized, to the way that it's changed, and above all, to that autonomous experiences of the individuals who have them. I just think it's like fascinating, rigorous, clear-eyed, ethically committed, and a really cool work. It's also like a fun read. I don't know, like
great. No, I'm really glad to hear that.
so much of it is in the words of your subjects who were clearly really generous with your time, and clearly you got a lot of trust from them, but also you frame their experiences so beautifully. I really encourage people to read this because I had a blast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading it and thinking through it with me. And of course, for spending this hour with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andréa. All right, this is the last chance for a question. Going once, going twice. Thank
Oh,
you.
Ushma's work is really, really excellent.
Oh, really?
Everyone
All
should look for it.
right. Thank you to City Lights for having us. Peter, you made this so easy for me. I had a great time, and thank you to everybody for coming.
Well, I want to thank the both of you for gracing our virtual halls. And this is really an astoundingly wonderful and very, very important book. So Andréa Becker, congratulations. And Moira, thank you again for doing the honors. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. Of course, today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and all our educational outreach. I want to thank you all. So please take care, be kind to each other, and we hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.